Benoit, tell us a little bit about how you got to the carbon finance unit.
You know, I was living in Russia. I was writing my dissertation at the time, and the Kyoto Protocol had just been adopted, and the first carbon fund had just been set up by the World Bank. And I was just admitted into the Young Professionals program at the time, and I was starting to look for my next assignment. And so I was really interested in finding out what this prototype carbon fund was doing. I was studying more the environmental taxation side of things, and so became really curious and interested in the market-based, the setting the quantity and letting the price adjust, as opposed to setting the price and letting the quantity adjust. So I got in touch with Ken Newcomb, the manager at the time, and I remember vividly that we had a conference call, you and he and Odile and a few other people, and that's how I joined the unit.
Okay. And did you start working on the prototype carbon fund, or did you start looking at the new products? Because you know, you're known for setting up the forest part of the carbon business.
But I very much started with the prototype carbon fund. I remember I took part in setting the baseline for the Morocco wind power project with Johannes. I was also then put in charge of the bioenergy project at Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, it's Filosa, and the district heating project in Sofia. And then the idea emerged of a forest prototype carbon fund, which ended up being named the Biocarbon Fund.
So before we go to the Biocarbon Fund and the FCPF, what were your earliest memories of the work around you know, the Morocco Tarfaya project or Sfilosa or the district heating projects?
Well, I remember an amazing level of enthusiasm by a group of entrepreneurs within the World Bank, each with their own sort of expertise and take on one product that involved the public sector and the private sector, and really was designed to demonstrate the Kyoto Protocol's flexible mechanism. So it was an elating time. Everything seemed possible, you know, trying to introduce these new mechanisms for doing the right thing to save the planet.
And what about the clients? Did they understand what we were trying to do or what you were trying to do in these projects?
You know, I remember that we took time to educate or at least sensitize the clients, and we had these, you know, rather nice PowerPoint presentations with a black background, which also distinguished us from others. And we spent quite a bit of time, I think, on the road, you know, explaining what this thing was, you know, what the Kyoto Protocol was, what Article 6 and Article 12 were meant to achieve, and how they could benefit as well as, obviously, the potential buyers. I remember there being a lot of hype around the all-in cost, and that it should not, you know, exceed, you know, $4 or something like that. And I remember also vividly with a project in Hungary when that famous $4 mark was passed. You know, that ceiling was shattered. So yeah, it was a very exciting time.
And you know, later, if I remember correctly, you focused mostly on joint implementation projects, even though you'd done the Morocco CDM. Was there much of a difference between JI and CDM, or it involved similar concepts?
Well, it involved the similar concepts, but there was also this fungibility between the emission reduction units and what were they called, the AAUs, right? The assigned amount units, which made it quite exciting vis-a-vis the European countries and the EU members in particular. And then, of course, there was a specificity that made joint implementation theoretically more favorable to forests. And we're going to talk about it in a second. It never really materialized, unfortunately.
Yeah. Now, the reason I ask is because most people don't seem to appreciate, that the Paris Agreement creates an environment which we've lived through before, no? In the sense of the joint implementation and the NDC theoretically having some sort of commitment or caps for every country, and going through the process of trying to understand, even when you're doing a project-based offsets, you're still having to make a decision around your cap, so to speak.
That's right.
And the consideration around that, you think will have an impact on the way developing countries think, or how do you think that will play out?
I don't know. Quite
Okay.
frankly, I haven't really thought about it. But I mean, there was a sense that the clean development mechanism was a bit of free for all. I mean that the fact that China and India and Brazil could sell as much as they could without any obligations of their own was considered an issue, and I think it gave the CDM a bit of a bad reputation. Now the Paris Agreement does operationalize the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, but common and responsibilities nevertheless. So I think in that sense we're on better grounds philosophically or morally, should I say.
And in terms of the environment inside the institution, at that point of time where Jim Wolfenson had kind of created an environment where the bank was trying to identify new mission, how did that play out in the development of the overall carbon finance business? Did it have an impact?
I think that Jim Wolfenson created an enabling environment, gave a lot of freedom to these pioneers at the time. But I don't think the institution quite realized what was going on. And it took several years before it did, or at least some people did. And it wasn't necessarily the happiest outcome when they realized how much freedom, how much autonomy that business had acquired, not illegally. It's just took it because it's an institution where you can take initiative and you can gather quite a bit of autonomy. But I think there was a perception that it had gone too far, and that was, I think, unfortunate. I believe the institution could have done a better job of grooming or continuing to cultivate that incredible asset, that incredible machine. And if we are where we are today, it is not fully, at least, thanks to our senior management. I think to a certain extent it's in spite of our senior management, and we proved very resilient. But the senior management could have done, I think, a better job of even harvesting all the positive aspects of that business.
And looking back, looking back 20 years and being in this institution all that while and going up the ladder, so to speak, what is your own, message to people who want to encourage innovation, want to encourage new products? How, both to the staff who are interested in doing that and to managers who are supposed to enable them? What is your message?
Well, there's one thing I learned from Ken Newcomb, and I like to remind him. and that's, I think, very important. It's believe in yourself and believe in others. It's an institution that gives you quite a bit of power of initiative, and you should use it. Now, you should use it well. You shouldn't break the rules. But there is, I think, many ways in which you can realize your vision and live your dreams while following the rules. The rules actually do create that room for maneuver. But you need to believe in yourself, you know, and not think that this institution is there and gives you the parameters that you will have to live by forever. It's not like that. And then believe in others. You cannot do things on your own. You need to rely on and work with others. And you need to work with people who are not necessarily, in fact, preferably, are not of the same opinion as you are. I think if you surround yourself with a diverse team, which we had at the time, we had lots of heated arguments. You are strong because you predict what the outside community is going to tell you. And so that's my message to others. If you believe that you can do something, if you believe that there is a new area of business that you can develop, try it, and talk to your managers about it, and try to fit it in, and work for it. Don't think that it's going to come your way, that the institution will ask you to do things. It won't. You know, the power of the individual, a few individuals who stick together, right, and speak of each other well, I think is extremely powerful.
And from the manager's point of view, what would the message be in order to create an enabling environment?
Well, you need to let people do things that they believe in. You know, just rely on them, listen to what they see, to whom, you know, what other people are telling them, and then let these good ideas come in, and see how these ideas are in fact in line with the World Bank's vision. Yeah. And oftentimes we we don't give new ideas necessarily all the consideration that they deserve. We're very busy, we do many things, and so we get caught up in a lot of routines when in fact, there are huge challenges, and if the World Bank isn't up to the task, the question is who is. Again, we don't do this by ourselves, but certainly we have a responsibility.
So let's turn to the Biocarbon Fund and your journey to the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the whole new line of business that you pioneered in the bank. How did that journey from the Prototype Carbon Fund to the Biocarbon Fund to the FCPF start? And what was the process?
Well, we had a colleague working on Romania who had heard of the Prototype Carbon Fund and was interested in learning whether there was anything in there that could, complement his own IBRD-funded forestry project in Romania. And so he invited me to come along. We hired a consultant from Finland, a forester, who is now inside the bank. And we assessed options for Romania. And that became actually an afforestation project in the Danube Delta, forest regeneration really, using native species mostly. And this became the first joint implementation project, so we can be very proud of it. And from then on, there was a dynamic. The Romanians infected the Moldovans, infected in a positive sense, of course, until Ken said, look, we need to set up a dedicated fund for this. It has too much peculiarity, it has its own dynamics, its own critics. and maybe we should dedicate a fund to it. So the idea, emerged, which became the Biocarbon Fund, with its own set of investors, its own set of methodologies, its own portfolio, which was fascinating. A mix of joint implementation, but mostly clean development mechanism, mostly developing countries. We helped China develop its first forest sequestration, carbon sequestration project in forests, and China then picked up all the good ideas and took them to a level we would never have hoped. And then a couple of years later, based on this experience that we had accumulated managing the Biocarbon Fund, we were approached by the Nature Conservancy to try and do something about reducing tropical deforestation, which is something that was not eligible under the Clean Development Mechanism. Under the Clean Development Mechanism, we were restricted to afforestation and reforestation. We tried to do forest management, we tried to do rangeland management in joint implementation countries, but it didn't really go anywhere, even though we tried. And meanwhile, the big game was tropical forest loss. So the developing countries at the time decided that they'd had enough with this rather exclusive game that India, China, Brazil played, and they too wanted to participate. And the main area through which they could participate in a carbon finance mechanism was forests and tropical forests. And we were losing 13 million hectares of tropical forests at the time. And so it made sense to do something about it. That was the second most important source of greenhouse gas emissions before transport, after energy, before transport. And so the idea then of a partnership, much broader partnership, much more complex, arose, and that became the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility.
So who were the key partners in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility? Because I understand some of them were common to the other carbon funds, but it did bring in a unique set of players as well, right?
Yes, it did. In fact, the big difference was that the main supporters were the forest countries, as a matter of fact, the tropical forest countries. Papua New Guinea, the Congo Basin countries, and a few others. And we were very fortunate that in 2007, it was, Germany was hosting the G7 summit and presiding the G7. And when we went to Germany and presented this idea, they saw a really promising topic for their G7 agenda, because it had to do with forests and climate change and biodiversity. And lo and behold, the G7 communique of the Heiligendamm summit gave a mandate to the World Bank to start a partnership. So after a couple of design workshops in Germany, basically Germany gave the keys to the bank and said, there you go, now take this forward. So we had a number of governments, but we also had the Nature Conservancy that became an investor. BP actually became an investor too, because it was looking into alternative sources of energy, and forests was actually also an interesting area for them. But I would say the governance structure was completely reformed. So from the traditional carbon funds, which included the financiers and the World Bank, we had to broaden to give an equal number of seats to forest countries as to the investors. So that became a big difference. And the other big difference is that we created quite a large number of observer positions. Non-governmental organizations from the north and from the south, and then by region, and then indigenous peoples by region, and then women's groups and parliamentarians. And that created a very large, fairly heavy governance structure, but very inclusive. It was felt necessary because forests have this tendency to trigger passionate debates, much more, I would say, than the traditional, flexible mechanisms. It has to do with the rights, the identity, the rights to land, cultural identity, survival, for lots and lots of people. In fact, when we announced the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility at the Bali COP, we had protest on our hands. We had 200 protesters who blockaded the hall where we were meeting, such that the World Bank president had to be escorted, through the back door. It was remarkable. It surprised us how antagonistic the relations were. So that forced us to enter into very deep, extensive dialogues, in particular with indigenous peoples and southern civil society, to explain what this was about. And after a couple of years, there was the realization that they too could be participants and beneficiaries. And I must say that today a lot of them have now become allies of the bank and see us as allies too. In fact, this week I'm meeting with a couple of indigenous peoples leaders from the Democratic Republic of Congo who have become friends and business partners, whereas 10 years ago, they saw me as enemy number one. It's remarkable, really, the new relations that this partnership has created.
Yeah. The carbon business itself always had people who didn't like what the World Bank was doing. But on the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility was the first one where truly the World Bank engaged in a partnership mode rather than just on a product development mode or working with donors. And I think while it's taken a long time to come to a understanding of each other's perspective, I think the overall initiative is stronger because of it. No, I mean, I think you are in a situation where there is a possibility to use this opportunity to design new things. And how do you see that moving forward from here? Because there's been usually some concern about the slow progress, but speeding up to a much bigger agenda.
Indeed, I still remember the lead EU negotiator who had become convinced that this was a good initiative. He wanted the first emission reductions payment agreements. We ended up changing purchase to payment agreements, the first ERPAs, to be signed by the COP in Copenhagen. This was 2009, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we only just signed the first ERPA a month ago. Only 9 years later. So clearly, the speed has not been, great. But all this time was taken, as you suggested, to really build a coalition around it and find modus operandi, rules, benefit sharing principles that would be inclusive. And because of the number of beneficiaries and how scattered they are, negotiating rules that everybody can agree to, it took a really long time. Just the methodological framework of the carbon fund part of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility by itself took about 2 years. And until you had the rules in place, you could, of course, not sign an emission reductions payment agreement. But now we have our first one, and in a country as complicated as the Democratic Republic of Congo. So not only do we have a solid basis that can be replicated, but others in the proto market are looking at it as a primary source, maybe something that they can tweak by adding some rules or features to the methodological framework that can actually allow, for example, the aviation sector to buy offsets. So as you said, I see a lot of potential for growth, and if it works, and I hope that we will be able to sign 10, 15 such agreements, we will have laid the groundwork for a lot of engagements, market-based engagements, or at least commercial type engagements to allow developing countries to really sell assets and benefit for their development goals. It's very important to know that they see forests as an engine for green growth. They don't necessarily see them as carbon reservoirs, but they understand that because of the climate mitigation value that their forests play, there is a revenue source that they can capture, which they can then use to finance their development. And I think it's a healthy and a positive outcome. And we will now see, I think, upward pressure on price, just the same way that we did 10 years ago when the glass ceiling of $4 was shattered on this famous Hungary project. We will see, I believe, pretty soon pressure to go beyond the $5, which is currently proposed as the standard for forest carbon under the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility.
Okay. And the growth, you think, you mentioned the aviation sector and CORSIA. In addition to that, do you see a great potential under the Paris Agreement for the forest carbon sector to grow much faster?
I do. It will partly depend, I believe, on how fungible the mitigation outcomes from forests can be with other types of assets. This has been a bit the holy grail in this business. Can forest carbon, a unit of emission reduction from forest carbon projects, become fungible with other units? In the JI world, by definition, it was. We didn't have that benefit in the clean development mechanism. But there are now colleagues outside of the institution who are busy working on that, and that will have to do, with the quality of the asset in particular. And there's all sorts of quality levels and pedigrees in forest carbon, just as, I guess, other types of carbon assets. But it will be particularly important to have, carbon that is low or has zero leakage, is as permanent as possible in particular. Those are the two key features, right? The absence or presence of leakage and absence or presence of reversibility.
Yeah, permanence.
Permanence.
Yeah. So if you look back over the last almost 20 years, what are the things that you think the bank got right, and what could it have done better?
Right. Well, I think what the bank got right is this game-changing feature that carbon finance has, which is putting monitoring and verification at the heart of the financial flow. It is so refreshing for development professionals such as ourselves to have an objective basis for transferring resources to our clients. We can be friends, but we don't have to be business partners unless there's a verification report. And I think this is a lesson that goes beyond carbon finance, is pay attention to what happens on the ground. we're all hopeful that projects will go right, but unless you go year after year to see what is going on, you can be wrong at the beginning, and monitoring and performance-based payments are, I think, extremely powerful. And we, in fact, now see performance-based payments, output-based aid, really growing. The P4R program for results itself, I think, is an internalization of this concept. Though, of course, it doesn't go as far as monitoring carbon, but why not? So I would say that was a key, achievement that the bank incorporated, which wasn't easy for an institution that was used to project-based finance. To switch to results-based finance wasn't, a foregone conclusion. Where I think we could have done better was to try and marry project-based finance and results-based finance. And I think we swung, the pendulum perhaps swung too far to results-based, and we let projects come in that were not necessarily owned and recognized by the bank. We were very opportunistic in seeking opportunities outside. We didn't look at our own portfolio. There were reasons for that. A big one, of course, being this need for additionality, which was a bit of a perverse rule. And I think a lot has been learned about that. So looking forward, I would hope that as we develop new products, we really try to find the complementarity between the bank's more traditional business and performance-based payments. And I think there is a whole lot of it. In fact, at the time, Ian Johnson, our vice president, had said, carbon finance and GEF, the Global Environment Facility, he said it's a marriage made in heaven. It was never really consumed, however, because of the additionality problem. And so I think now we need to work harder on making this happen and work with the bank managers so that they really internalize the mechanism. A bit like at the time, the task team leader for that forestry project in Romania had actually requested our help. Instead, I think we were a bit too much in the supply mode and did not cultivate the demand enough. That's my point of view.
So let's talk a little bit about the institution in 2001 and 2002 and institution, the World Bank as it is today. Do you think we are much better placed now to take a leadership role in addressing the climate change agenda through market-based instruments?
Well, I think we are. The work that has been accomplished, the number of demonstration projects, the development of methodologies, the understanding amongst hundreds of people who've now been exposed to the flexible mechanisms, the principle of performance-based payments, the level of buy-in at senior management levels now in the institution. We would have dreamed 10 years ago to have that. Exactly. How are we going to use it today is a question. Are we going to rest on our laurels, or are we going to keep pushing the boundary? Because the Paris Agreement is not a straightforward framework. It's very broad. It could send us in many different directions. at least the Kyoto Protocol was clear. It had two mechanisms, and it had restrictions, but it was rather simple. The Paris Agreement leaves a lot of room for innovation, but potentially fragmentation, diversity, inconsistencies, etc. And so now, with all the experience that we have, the support, the understanding, what are we going to make of the Paris Agreement in the institution? I forgot to mention, but it's very important, the networks that we have created. Networks, many networks, amongst client countries, potential seller countries, and of course all the buyers who still work with us, and the regulator. Yes, I think we now need to look inside ourselves and look around and decide what to do. But I hope we will be bold, because we were bold 10 years ago. And despite the uncertain regulatory environment, despite the lack of familiarity of senior management, we got so far. Surely, it's got to be easier this time around.
I honestly, as you mentioned, the flexibility of the Paris Agreement allows you a much bigger space for innovation, and I think the challenge this time is to utilize all the expertise and experience we have to move the agenda forward. But what are the constraints that you see? I see a huge amount of potential, but why is it not happening? Why is the progress slower, or at least seems slower?
I mean, perhaps the fact that the bank has now become so involved in climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, has become involved in so many initiatives, gives us baggage in a certain sense. We have to consider all these funds, all these programs, all these partners we now have, and to go back to the drawing board, which is what innovation entails, is hard, right? We like to cruise, it's more comfortable. We do what we know, and we don't necessarily know what we don't know. And I think it's going to take going back to this whiteboard, taking time off from all of our activities. We're all busy now. All the carbon finance specialists and all the climate change specialists are busy. They're busy doing things. We don't have the luxury of being this group of innovators who had effectively a book to write, and they had the mandate to write it. We were unencumbered. We had a mandate, but we were not busy doing other things. It was a bunch of us really focusing on getting the job done, this new job. We now have other jobs. And unless we can create that space, the time, get the resources, the freedom of thinking, we may find it difficult to truly innovate.
Yeah, that's a good point. So to conclude, what would your almost advice be to people who are engaged in the space of innovation? There are the new group of people who are designing products around the Paris Agreement mechanisms. What would you tell them to do, if you could?
Well, I think they have a pretty good sense themselves what they need to do. I think. Well, I would still tell them to tap into the business potential, the ideas that are themselves, that exist or are being incubated in the World Bank in terms of potential source of assets. But beyond that, I think management needs to give them the space. Otherwise, I think management is going to have false expectations. We need to give them the space, the time, and the resources.
Any other general comment or suggestions or ideas on how we should move the overall business forward? Or I agree with you that the first thing that is needed is a little more enabling environment for innovation around the new products for Paris. And little more partnership with our donor countries. But the Paris Agreement allows you much more freedom in terms of working with developing countries as well. And we've not done that, except in the case of FCPF or in the forest carbon partnership facilities. Is there a lesson to be learned from the FCPF kind of experience on partnerships for the Paris Agreement, you think?
Partnership is good. It enables you to go far, but it is heavy. And I'm not sure that innovation requires a very broad partnership to begin with. In fact, I would probably disagree with that. Consulting, listening, being alert to a range of opinions, I think is important, but I would not necessarily structure a partnership to begin with. Innovation needs agility, flexible structures, moving fast, and then of course, as the ideas gain ground and traction, then you need to make sure that they are solidly anchored. One area that bank management ought to consider is the role of performance-based payments in the context of IDA and IBRD. It is a bit of a puzzle to me why we are able to design and grow the program for result mechanism and not linking this to performance in climate change mitigation. We are still a bit schizophrenic, and that doesn't have to be the case. I remember hearing that the president of Costa Rica years ago had come to the World Bank and talked to Jim Wilkinson about potentially reimbursing World Bank loans in carbon credits. I mean, that was far-fetched, but one should reflect on this. And without going quite that far, would it be possible for World Bank resources, IDA and IBRD, to be made available, disbursed, on the basis of climate action, including emission reductions? Why not?
Why not?
And I think we would show to our IDA donors and IBRD subscribers that we do care about climate change. And so senior management ought to start connecting the dots.
Great. Thanks a lot.